the address on Kevin Warsh, the new Fed chair, the man before the chair, Kevin Warsh, an address on the brief history of Kevin Warsh and the Federal Reserve. He started his tenure May 15th. And so this is the compilation that I've compiled to demarcate the current time, the monetary era we entered. Even though it seems like nothing, I think it's a big deal. And I think we're going to look back on this as a very positive thing, possibly. And I'm being optimistic. There's no guarantees, but in light of the facts in the history, a long history of that you can study of not just Jerome Powell, but Kevin Warsh, the new Fed chair, and they will be working alongside each other on the same table from here forward. And there are moments in the life of a nation when the person chosen to lead an institution tells you something about the era itself. Kevin Warsh's confirmation as the 17th chairman of the Federal Reserve on May 13th, 2026 is one of those moments. He steps into the chair on May 15th, and he just started his tenure this week. 2 days after the Senate confirmed him, 54-45, with Pennsylvania Democrat John Fetterman, the only member to cross the aisle and vote in favor of Kevin Warsh, which is pretty interesting. The margin tells its own story, and so does the timeline, and so does the man himself, Kevin. So to understand the moment, you must understand the man and the mind. To understand the mind, you must understand the path. And for that, you must understand what Kevin Warsh has built and done over the past 15 years when no one was watching. No one knew about this, but until as of recently, the past few years, Kevin has been nominated and really nominated by Trump in the Trump administration, but also Trump has been leaning into him to cut rates, which is something that Powell has been holding back on because of the inflation hasn't quite reached target, and whatever other factors that they play into, like employment, isn't exactly so clear right now with all the things happening in the efficiency, productivity, and artificial intelligence. So Kevin Maxwell Warsh was born on April 13th, 1970 in Albany, New York, the youngest of 3 children. His father built companies, his mother wrote stories. He grew up in Londonville and competed in tennis through his high school years at the Shaker High School. He went to Stanford, studied public policy, and graduated in 1992. He went to East Harvard Law, earned his degree in 1995, and joined Morgan Stanley in mergers and acquisitions the following year, rising to vice president and executive director of investment banking at Goldman Sachs. He was a lawyer before he was a central banker, and he was a banker before he was a central banker. As with Jerome Powell, that distinction matters. The economists who have run the Federal Reserve have, with notable regularity, mistaken the model for the market. Warsh seems to know the difference. In 2002, President George W. Bush brought him into the White House as a special assistant for economic policy and executive secretary of the National Economic Council. He entered government in the aftermath of Enron and WorldCom. We're talking about, 2001, 2009? Or both. When trust in American institutions was shaken and the rules governing corporate behavior were being rewritten in real time. 4 years later, 2006, Bush nominated Kevin Warsh to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and he was among the youngest appointees in the institution's history. He arrived without a doctorate, without an academic pedigree, and without the standard credentials of central banking. What he brought instead was something that institution had lacked: real-time market experience, legal discipline, and a White House understanding of how consequential decisions are made under pressure, on incomplete information, against the clock. Chairman Ben Bernanke, assigned him a new mission: integrate capital market intelligence into the Fed's decision-making in ways that had not previously existed. That assignment would take on an entirely different meaning within 2 years. The financial crisis struck in 2008, Kevin Warsh became one of its most active participants. He worked closely alongside Bernanke and New York Fed President Timothy Geithner. He negotiated directly with Wall Street. He helped his former firm Morgan Stanley survive the meltdown. The balance sheet doubled in a quarter. The emergency lending facilities deployed at an unprecedented scale. QE1 launched as a crisis measure, and he supported it without hesitation. And the scale of what required was clear to him. The case for emergency intervention was not in dispute. But his reservations about what came next were immediate. They were documented from the beginning, and they never went away. By March 2011, when he resigned from the board before his term expired, he had already described quantitative easing as limited, circumscribed, and subject to regular review. A standard he believed the institution had quietly abandoned. That resignation was itself a statement. Governors do not resign before their terms expire for procedural reasons. He left the institution because he was moving in a direction he could not endorse, or the institution was moving in a direction he could not endorse, even from inside it. And for the next 15 years, up until now, Kevin Warsh had built an intellectual case with unusual discipline and consistency. His argument ran on a single thread. The Fed's balance sheet had grown beyond any defensible mandate. Quantitative easing had redirected capital from the real economy to financial assets. Forward guidance had reduced both flexibility and credibility, and the institution had accumulated influence and authority that properly belonged to elected government. He was not quiet about it. As in 2015, he told CNBC, "Financial markets and the treasury market are telling us almost nothing about the state of the economy because central banks are influencing those prices with every word, every nuanced speech from every Reserve Bank president." In 2016, he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "The Federal Reserve needs new thinking. Its models are unreliable, its policies erratic, and its guidance confusing." And that's correlated with the chairman, Jerome Powell, coming in 2016. And in 2018, just 2 years later, standing alongside Ben Bernanke and reviewing a decade of quantitative easing, he said that my overriding concern about continued QE then and now involves the misallocations of capital in the economy and the misallocation of responsibility in our government. Misallocations seldom operate under their own name. They choose other names to hide behind. They tend to linger for years in plain sight, until they emerge with force at the most inauspicious of times and do unexpected harm to the economy. At the Hoover Institution, he puts mechanics plainly. If we would run the printing machine a little quieter, we could have then lowered interest rates. So that's a keynote. These were not stray remarks. They were not a performance. This is his worldview, argued across 15 years at a consistent register without revision, its essential conclusion. A warning delivered in public repeatedly to an institution that did not have to yet listen to him. And an honest account of Kevin Warsh's history over the past 15 years requires stating the complexities directly. So he had voted for QE2 in November 2010, and simultaneously, a few days later, published in a Wall Street Journal an op-ed criticizing that very policy that he had formally approved. In October 2024, he publicly questioned the Fed's rate cut, accusing the institution of abandoning data dependence. 13 months later, in November 2025, he published an op-ed in the same publication calling for rate cuts. His monetary policy positions have at times tracked the political environment more closely than the economic calendar. Senator Elizabeth Warren was direct about it. She called him a sock puppet for the administration and warned that installing him as the chair would represent a presidential takeover of the Federal Reserve. That's just the facts on the record. That's part of the account. And that's the lens through which his tenure will be measured. Whether that independence is held and the credibility of the institution at the Federal Reserve remains intact by supporters and critics alike, That record is what it is. What he does with the chair is what matters now. On January 30th, 2026, President Trump nominated Kevin Warsh as chair of the Federal Reserve. The confirmation process was contentious. It was shaped by a Department of Justice investigation into Jerome Powell. It was delayed by Senator Tom Tillis's blockade, maintained until the investigation was resolved. It was watched by markets, policymakers, and the public with a degree of attention that itself measured the stakes. At his confirmation hearing before the Senate Banking Committee on April 21st, 2026, Warsh addressed the question of independence without ambiguity. He said, "The president never once asked me to commit to any particular interest rate decision, period. Nor would I ever agree to do so if he had. I would be an independent actor if confirmed as chair of the Federal Reserve. So let me be clear. Monetary policy independence is essential." The Senate Banking Committee advanced his nomination 13-11 on April 29th. The Senate confirmed him as governor 51-45 on May 12th. The Senate confirmed him as chair 54-45 on May 13th, 2026, with John Fetterman once again being the only Democrat to cross out vote in favor. He was sworn in on May 15th. His first FOMC meeting as chair is scheduled for June 16th or 17th. Next month, 2026. He inherits a Federal Reserve with a federal funds rate of 3.5 to 3.75%. He inherits CPI running at 3.8% year over year as of April 2026. Above target and moving in the wrong direction, he inherits gas prices rising at the fastest pace in 30 years following the outbreak of conflict with Iran. He inherits committee where the regional Fed president signaled at the April 2026 FOMC meeting that the next move could easily be a rate cut as easily be an increase as a cut. He inherits a Governor Jerome Powell who remains on the board with a full vote through January 2028. And he also inherits a president who wants him to lower rates and who nominated him to deliver that. Although he's mentioning how he will remain independent and monetary policy independence is essential. He also inherits the accumulated consequences of the very policies he spent 15 years arguing against. The balance sheet that is now near $6.7 trillion reflects choices made across 4 rounds of quantitative easing, across 2 administrations in response to a financial crisis, a pandemic, and a decade of demand management conducted at the limits of what monetary policy can reasonably deliver. He did not create those conditions, but he must navigate from inside them. The Federal Reserve's independence is not a technocratic preference. It is the mechanism by which monetary credibility is protected from the political cycle. When it holds, inflation stays anchored, markets function, and the dollar remains and retains that trust that makes it the world's reserve currency. When it erodes, the costs are felt by every American who buys groceries, pays rent, or carries a mortgage. The case for it does not rest on deference to experts. It rests on more than a century of evidence that credibility once lost is expensive and prolonged to restore. In the new era, the United States entering a period of structural economic transformation that has no recent precedent in its combination of components. And the Federal Reserve Chairman who governs monetary policy through it will shape the cost of capital for the entire investment cycle that follows. The AI infrastructure build-out now underway represents capital deployment at a scale not seen since the electrification of the American economy. Public and private commitments to computational infrastructure are running well into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The onshoring of manufacturing capacity, accelerated by tariff policy and supply chain reorientation, is rebuilding domestic industrial production in critical materials, semiconductors, advanced technologies, and defense-adjacent sectors that the United States has coded across 3 prior decades. Energy production is expanding. Deregulation is reducing the cost of capital formation. The structural architecture of a new American industrial economy is being assembled, not just in theory, but in reality by the capital allocation decisions being made right now. That is not a demand cycle, it is a supply expansion. And that is for the Federal Reserve Chairman, who has spent 15 years arguing that monetary policy must take supply side dynamics more seriously, a meaningful one. The deflationary potential embedded in AI-driven productivity is not speculative in its mechanism, it is structural in its direction. When automation reduces the marginal costs of labor-intensive services, when computational intelligence accelerates decision cycles across logistics, manufacturing, and finance, and when the coordination costs that have historically limited productivity gains collapse under the weight of better information processed faster, the inflationary pressure that blunt demand management is designed to address may give way to a supply-side dynamic that monetary policy has not had to navigate at this scale since the early decades of the Industrial Revolution, or the late 19th century. A monetary framework less dependent on blunt rate tools and forward guidance, and more attentive to structural signals, which Warsh has argued for consistently, may find more traction in this era than any preceded it. In the Trump administration's economic agenda rests on the structural pillars that are, in their medium-term implications, supply-side in character, tariffs, trade reorientation, to rebuild domestic industrial capacity, energy dominance through expanded domestic production, deregulation to reduce the cost of capital formation, and fiscal investment in infrastructure, technology, and defense. Each of these carries inflationary implications in the short term and disinflationary or deflationary implications over the medium term, if the supply-side response materializes as intended. Now, the Federal Reserve under Warsh is being asked to navigate that transition. The president wants lower rates. Lower rates accelerate investment and growth in the near term. Warsh has argued that lower rates are achievable, but only if the balance sheet is disciplined and inflation credibility is preserved. The tension between those two positions is not theoretical. It will define his first 2 years at the chair. But the alignment goes deeper than that rate policy. Both the administration and the incoming chairman operate from a conviction that the institutional frameworks governing the American economy were built for the era that has passed. The administration attempting to remake trade architecture, industrial policy, and the structure of global supply chains. Warsh is attempting to remake that monetary framework that governs how the Fed interprets price stability, manages its balance sheet, and communicates its intentions to markets. These are parallel reform projects, running on parallel tracks in the same political and economic environment at this very moment. Whether they compound constructively or collide along the way is the institutional story of the next 4 years. What is visible now is the opening condition, for which the first time in the post-2008 era, both the executive branch and the central bank are led by actors who believe the existing framework must change and who have publicly stated what they intend to build in its place, and why this moment may be his. Jerome Powell spent 8 years building a record by which history will judge him. Kevin Warsh has spent many years building an intellectual framework by which he intends to be guided. Powell managed through crises and that required improvisation. Warsh arrives with convictions already formed, arguments already tested in public, and a philosophy already stress-tested against a decade of events he watched from the outside of the institution. That 15-year remove from the chair is not a liability. It is, in the current environment, something closer to an advantage. He is not defending the policies of the prior era. He is not tied to the models that failed to anticipate the post-pandemic inflation surge. He is not required to explain why the transitory call was made and held as long as it was. He enters with a clean slate on precisely the questions that define this very moment. The reforms he has called for are substantive and, in the current political environment, plausible. A revised inflation framework that weighs supply-side indicators more deliberately, a balance sheet reduction path that is methodical, transparent, and not hostage to each month's CPI print. A governance model less reliant on forward guidance and more reliant on reactive precision. A Fed that, in his words at the Hoover Institution, straightens itself from its defensive crouch. These are not the reforms of a caretaker. These are the reforms of a chairman who intends to lead. Paul Volcker is worth recalling here. He arrived in 1979 with a single settled conviction: inflation had to be broken, whether the short-term cost. He held it through recession, through enormous political pressure, through market volatility that would have redirected a less certain man. When he was done, he had restored what economists call the nominal anchor, the credibility of the dollar as a store of value, and the credibility of the Fed as its guardian. That credibility financed 3 decades of growth thereafter. Warsh arrives in 2026 with a different problem, but a structurally similar task. Inflation is not at 1979 levels. It is at 3.8% and moving in the wrong direction under conditions of geopolitical stress. The balance sheet is not a theoretical concern, it's a $6.7 trillion fact. The credibility of the institution is not a Volcker-era nadir, but it has been genuinely tested by the inflation call of 21 and 22, by the political turbulence surrounding its own appointment. What Kevin Warsh brings to the task is a settled conviction, a tested argument, and an unusual combination of market intelligence and philosophical discipline that has not been present at the head of the Federal Reserve since the institution last had to genuinely rebuild itself. And finally, the new monetary era. Let the record be stated directly: this era of the Federal Reserve as the dominant actor in American economic management is closing. The era in which balance sheet expansion was the primary tool of economic governance is which forward guidance substituted for clear and consistent policy, in which the 2/3% target, or the 2% inflation target, was treated as both an achievable floor and a sufficient framework for a supply-disrupted economy. That era ended on May 15th. What follows it is still being written, but its opening lines are visible. They read: discipline over expansion, market signals over model outputs, supply-side awareness over demand-side orthodoxy, and credibility over convenience. Warsh has argued for each of those positions across 15 years. He now holds the chair that will determine whether the argument converts into a durable policy. The administration behind him is structurally aligned on the components that make that conversion possible: investment in domestic capacity, energy production, technological infrastructure, and manufacturing, reshoring that could, over a 4 to 6 year horizon, deliver the kind of supply-side expansion that makes price stability and growth simultaneously available and achievable. The AI revolution is not background noise to this story. It is potentially the most significant supply-side event since the Industrial Revolution, compressed into a decade with deflationary implications that conventional monetary policies have not been built to anticipate. A Federal Reserve chairman who understands capital misallocation, who argued for a framework more attentive to structural realities, and who arrives at the chair with a clear mandate for reform may be precisely what this inflection point requires. The FOMC has its own calendar, the institution has a way of absorbing its reformers, and the political pressure will not simplify it. None of that changes the essential condition, which is the conditions for a meaningful monetary transition from the post-2008 framework to something more disciplined and more structurally aware, are more present now than at any point in the past 15 years. Kevin Warsh has prepared exactly for this. So that's basically going to be a bit of a gist of the new concepts of this monetary era that we have just entered, given the differences between Jerome Powell and Kevin Warsh, although they will be at the same table in the inflationary pressures and the supply side dynamics of the infrastructure build out, and with the pressures of influence from political institutions and the government, all correlate to bring about what could be one of the biggest expansions of infrastructure and build out in American soil up until this point. So history will account for the rest of the story as it unfolds. And I look forward to next month when we have the first meeting and we get to see where he stands at that time. So that's it for the Kevin Warsh address. Just a bit of a compilation of information on Kevin Warsh and his incoming tenure. And there's even people inside the board of governors who also think that this might be just the right person for the job at this very time. And I would say that makes a lot of sense in it, given that we've had a very straightforward, a great time over the past 8 years with Jerome Powell. But things are changing and we're having a whole new dynamic, and the economy is changing in ways that only someone different could possibly make that difference. And the difficulties can be arrested, and now we can move forward into this actual deflationary expansion, which could happen in a short period of time, talking about 10 years or so. But it correlates with the market, the way the market's rallying, and the potential of a lot of these infrastructure names, even though a lot of them are probably not going to make it, but a good amount of them are going to be very successful, more successful than maybe any period of time before. And NVIDIA is the greatest example of that until this point.